Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started since we're at 2 o'clock. So how's everyone doing? Good? Folks have good weekends? Anybody do anything interesting over the weekend? Yeah?
I went to the march.
Oh, yeah, on Saturday. Did anybody else go to the march on Saturday? Yeah? So I heard it was like about 7,000 to 8,000 people strong in Tucson. I mean, the official estimates are like 5,000, but that it was a lot of people. One of the biggest marches in Tucson's history, I would imagine. So, how was it?
It was great.
Yeah?
People were really nice. They had some really cool signs.
It's all about the signs, huh?
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite that you remember really well?
There was, I can't even remember. There was one that had like bullshit, but then like the eye was like a assault rifle.
Okay.
Instead of,
I saw one that I liked that was like a kid holding up a sign that said, "When I said I'd rather die than go to math, I was kidding you assholes." Like something like that. I was just like, oh, that's great.
There was one with like a grandma that was holding.
Uh-huh.
Like, I have a picture of it. I don't remember what it said, but it was really.
Well, coincidentally, a clip that we're going to watch in today's lecture actually talks a little bit about violence and about gun violence and school shootings, kind of tangentially because it has to do with masculinity. But that's awesome that you went. Yeah, we had prospective graduate students in town, like potential recruits for our program. So on Saturday morning, I was showing them around. Actually, Cammie, that's why I saw you on 4th, is because I was driving them up and down 4th Avenue, pointing out everything. Like Antigone Books, I don't know if people know this, but Antigone Books on 4th Avenue is like the oldest feminist bookstore in the entire country, right, here in Tucson. And you thought Buffalo Exchange was the only thing that we had coming out of this. It was pretty cool, but no, also Antigone Books. Awesome. Well, I spent my weekend just like shopping and watching basketball, so it was a really fantastic weekend. And I don't know why, but I just have like, there's something about this week. I feel really, really good about this week. It feels like a good week. And I have like a lot of energy about it. But that's might just be because my doctor switched my dosage. I have no idea. So, oh, good. You guys are awake. So today we're going to be talking about masculinity, and we're going to be kind of riffing off of the same thing that we've been riffing off of for this unit, having a lot to do with cultural imperialism, and in particular the ways in which masculinity in the West is being kind of globalized and promoted all across the world. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the lecture, let me touch on a few little quick just like technical points. I'm almost done grading the midterms. I'm just have a few more essays to finish, so everybody will get those back on Thursday. Overall, I would say that pretty much most of you are looking pretty good on the midterm. There is kind of like a big divide between kind of what most of you, 90% of you, were doing in terms of length and meeting the different requirements of each question type, and then a smaller set of you who gave kind of comparatively short answers across the board. If you happen to fall into that category, I'm going to be emailing you individually to give you an opportunity to add on to your midterm and resubmit it for slightly higher credit, okay? For those of you who completed the midterm and met all of the requirements of it, please don't feel like this is some sort of a double standard in terms of, if you got a 95% on the exam, I hope it's okay with you that I'm not giving you a chance to get that last 5%, right? Nobody who I give a chance to to improve their grade on the midterm will be passing people who met the requirements of the midterm, right? So this won't create some sort of a weird two-tiered double standard. But for those of you who are aware that you might have submitted something that was really short of what you're able to do, know that I'll be giving you an opportunity to add on to that, okay? Other than that, this Thursday, we obviously have reading reflection number 3 due. I hope you're paying attention to the comments, in particular on reading reflection 2. And for a number of you, just fall back into the safety of the format of the reading reflections. A lot of you are starting to get really comfortable with this course material, and because of that, you're overwriting or you're trying to give yourself too much to do in 2.5 or 3 pages. Go back, revisit, the notes that you took when I was reviewing the reading reflections, revisit all of the detailed guidelines that are on D2L for the reading reflections, and really just keep it simple for yourself, keep it small, don't try and write about everything, really stick to a narrow topic and delve deep into that topic. So the next thing that I'm sure folks are kind of starting to think about, starting to be aware about, is the final paper. I'm going to be briefly talking about that next week so you can start to brainstorm your general topic for your final papers, which will be entirely of your choosing. allowing you to write about stuff that you personally know or are personally really interested in. And after this week, we have 3 weeks of material where we're doing Unit 4, which is all going to be about countercultural resistance in the Global South, right, against cultural imperialism. We have a reading reflection at the end of that unit, and then for all intents and purposes, we're done. The last 2.5 weeks of the semester in this class are spent just brainstorming and drafting and peer editing our papers, which will give hopefully everybody a chance to polish up their writing skills as well, since we'll be doing a lot of kind of instruction on how to write during those last couple weeks, all right? So are there any questions folks have in terms of those logistical things, big picture questions? Okay, so one final announcement. Since I handed back those participation and attendance sheets last week, I want folks to really pay attention to that number of what is possible, okay? For many of you, you can kind of coast and continue to do what you're doing, but for those of you who want to boost that grade, really every day is valuable, every day counts in terms of, we only have a few more Tuesdays and Thursdays before the end of the semester, so be speaking up. Even if that means you're asking questions during lectures, right, asking for clarification, it doesn't have to mean you're demonstrating a perfect knowledge of the course material. It can be you just trying to engage in discussion, engage in conversation, all right? So any questions before we get going? All right, so we're going to start off with a little bit of a review of the terms for this course to really hammer them down. Obviously, at this point, everybody should be really comfortable with the term cultural imperialism, but there was some new material last week that I want us to really revisit so that we can have a good understanding of how to determine whether or not a particular type of cultural exchange is cultural imperialism or is just sort of a neutral kind of exchange of cultures. So just to provide a little bit of review, again, cultural imperialism refers to the practice of promoting and imposing a culture, usually that of a more powerful nation over a less powerful society. And really important to that is that it determines general cultural values and standardizes civilizations, right? In other words, cultural imperialism has an ideology. Cultural imperialism is normative. It's not simply the appearance of a product in another part of the world, but it's the appearance of that product alongside an ideology that says this product is superior to your products and it comes from a culture that is superior to your culture, right? So cultural imperialism is accomplished through means that could be categorized under the 3 components of systemic oppression. In other words, cultural imperialism relies on existing institutions, right? Existing institutions. So it might be something like the internet, right? Or social media like Facebook, or a media sharing platform like YouTube, all of which are Western-based institutions, right? That are relied on, among many other institutions for the extension of cultural imperialism. Similarly, cultural imperialism relies on particular ideological beliefs about the cultural superiority typically of the West over the global South or non-Western parts of the world. And obviously, it really importantly involves individual behaviors, right? In other words, if all of us just decided to stop consuming and stop buying products and stop, talking about all of these sorts of things, if we were to just stop acting within these systems, right, then these things would kind of cease to be. So cultural imperialism really depends on individuals both in the West and in other parts of the world kind of participating in that process and participating in that system, right? But not all cultural exchange is cultural imperialism, and this is how we can tell. This is our kind of 3-part metric for determining whether or not something might be culturally imperialistic. So the first thing is this question of power, right? Who has the ability to make their culture available, desirable, and consumed in other parts of the world, right? So if we think about something like mediums, right? Media, various mechanisms for the communication of information, right? Most media, most mainstream media, mainstream mediums for the exchange of information are owned by Western corporations, right? So, things like YouTube, which is the, far and away the most popular movie sharing platform in the world, right? Not that there aren't other very popular ones, right? But YouTube would be an easy example of something that is owned, right, and operated within the West. So the question of who has the ability to make their power to make their culture available in the first place is really important here. So we might think of, for example, like a small island, right? A small island nation that has Coca-Cola products on its shelves everywhere, right? And on that small island, they make this really, really good drink, right? With some sort of native ingredients that are available there. But because of the fact that that island is so poor, and because of the fact that they don't have access to industrial resources and other things needed to mass produce that product for global consumption, they do not have the ability to make that available elsewhere, right? But that alone isn't enough, right? There are times when people with power are sending cultural products abroad in a totally benign, neutral, okay sort of way. And when those products get there, people have a choice to not consume them, which is why we need the second metric of agency, right? So once a product arrives somewhere else, right? For example, once a Western product arrives in a non-Western context, do people have a choice to not consume that product? Or does it become so ubiquitous and so widely available, right? And so much cheaper than all of the local alternatives that they have no choice pretty much but to consume that product. And then finally, this big question has a lot to do with kind of larger context questions, which is this cultural exchange decolonial? All cultural exchange globally is happening coming out of a context, right? It's coming out of a history where not very long ago, and even still today in some places in the world, colonialism existed or continues to exist, right? So the institutions, right, for example, that are used to exchange cultural products globally were built by colonial powers in a colonial era, which didn't end in most parts of the world until the 60s and the 70s, right? Not that long ago, just a few decades ago. So this history is recent, and this history isn't even close to being undone. We're not even close to being in a place where the global south and the global north are equal in terms of economic power. So this question then becomes, does this movement of cultural products and practices help combat or reinforce the effects of traditional colonialism, right? And we might think specifically about health, economic, or other disparities between the global north and global south. And when we were here last week, I think it might have been Ian who mentioned it, of education systems being an example. So it was John, of education systems being an example of something that might be taken from the West, developed in the West, and then exported, right, sent abroad to a place, but those education systems can help combat the effects of colonialism, can help combat things like economic disparities, like health disparities and stuff like that. So we really need to see all three of these things together to identify that something that's taking place is cultural imperialism. And what that leaves us with is actually a relatively small percentage of overall cultural exchange globally. Most cultural exchange globally is pretty benign, is pretty neutral, right? I'd like to think that when I go to get like Shogun Sushi, by the way, that's a plug for Shogun Sushi, fantastic sushi restaurant right up at River and Oracle. Really, really great, cheap prices, good discounts every day of the week, wonderful specials, and if you're 21, fantastic drink specials, I might add also, right? So I'd like to think, anyways, this is how I make side cash, right? That's why I film lectures, so I can show Shogun and be like, I plug this, and I tell them that behind the camera are 250 students, right? So anyway, if I'd like to think that when I go to Shogun Sushi, right, that action isn't in and of itself, right, contributing to a larger system that is harming Japanese people in Japan, right? And I'd like to think that most of what we do is not culturally imperialistic. But there are certain things that are really common. So when we think about things like cultural appropriation, right, are folks familiar with this term of cultural appropriation, right? So for example, Urban Outfitters went under fire a few years ago because they started using Native American indigenous print patterns and printing them on their clothing and selling them, right? Now, what this then kind of contributed to was this sort of taking of this particularly context-based cultural artifact and decontextualizing it, taking it out of its place of origin, its place of invention, right, and then mass producing it without any sort of context for the significance of this pattern, right? And a lot of people argued, well, this is sort of kind of cultural imperialism at home, right? That this use of native culture by Urban Outfitters in no way benefited, right, Native peoples, in no way boosted the economic stability of Native peoples, in no way helped, sell indigenously produced art, artifacts, etc., right? And so there was a lot of criticism about this. But again, we're talking about a relatively small percentage of overall cultural exchange, but nonetheless, it's still very, very important and powerful. So the final kind of thing that we're going to look at to review is this question of hegemony, and this was something we talked about last week. So hegemony refers to the social, political, cultural, or economic predominance of one power, idea, or entity over another. It's a word that's extremely common, and you hear it all the time used in conversation, not unlike the word ideology, and we always kind of have a feeling we know what it is, and we know what we're talking about. And in cultural studies specifically, we might talk about cultural hegemony, referring to the predominance of one cultural form over others, a form to which the majority of people, and I put in parentheses here, must consent and participate in here. And I say must because it's this question of agency, right? Do we even have a choice not to participate? Thus, we might talk about masculinity, femininity, whiteness, or other things, other identities as becoming culturally hegemonic. And to summarize what we've been talking about so far, this is kind of that one little nugget that captures everything, that Western cultural hegemony extends globally through practices of cultural imperialism. So the framework for this lecture is ultimately based off of this idea that cultural imperialism promotes Western culture in non-Western contexts in ways that specifically benefit the West and privilege Western cultural norms or artifacts. And through cultural imperialism, we've seen already particular manifestations of identity becoming hegemonic. So in week one, we talked about the bikini and the burqa and kind of contrasted them with one another and looked at how particular ideas about women's dress are becoming globalized, right? And this particularly Western narrative about women's freedom being expressed by showing more skin is becoming really globalized, right? Last week, we talked specifically about whiteness and the ways in which whiteness is being connected to beauty all over the world and in which skin lighteners and other Western kind of beauty products are being promoted across the globe to the benefit of Western corporations. And then finally, this week, we're going to talk about masculinity specifically and the ways in which a particularly Western-based idea of masculinity is really being promoted globally. So that's what this lecture is concerned with. Not only how this particular Western approach to masculinity has become globalized and culturally hegemonic, but also to what effects. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so first off, you need to remember that the geographic difference between the Western and Eastern Hemisphere is a geographic measurement, and then there's a cultural, and then there's an economic measurement. So typically when we're talking about culture, you think people talk about like East versus West, right? And then when people talk about economics, they'll talk about the global North versus the global South. And if you think about it, on a geographic economic level, this distinction makes sense. If you think about where all of the wealth in the world is concentrated, right? All the wealth in the world is concentrated in countries that are in the Northern Hemisphere, right? Whether that be in northern countries in Asia, across Europe, and through North America. Now, in terms of culture, people use this term East versus West, right? And this term actually has historical origins that go so far back that they kind of predate a lot of thinking around Africa, predate a lot of thinking around South Asia, and predate a lot of thinking around the Americas, right? So in other words, if you think about your world history class, right, and you think about how most world history classes are taught from a normally European perspective, describing the kind of like growth of European empire. And those days and age, thinking about the East and the West, right, was very much thinking about Western Europe and Europe versus the East, which was Asia, right, which was where the Silk Road went, right? So this sort of terminology, which is the same kind of that we talked about before with Orient versus Occident, right, that the Orient was used to refer, this is kind of a cartographic term, to the East, and the Occident was used to refer to the West, right? So Orientalism and this kind of cultural thing has a lot to do with this idea that there is such a thing as Eastern culture, which is cohesive, right? Which is a very Orientalist idea, right? In kind of the same way that it's silly for us to talk about Western culture in some sort of a cohesive way. However, what allows us to talk about Western culture in that way is that Western culture is becoming hegemonic, and it's becoming globalized, and it's becoming kind of ubiquitous. Does that help answer your question, Ian? Or does it make it just so much more confusing?
I just don't understand really the differentiation because I understand that Eastern, so you're finding Eastern cohesive, but it's more cohesive towards traditional culture, whereas West is becoming more progressive and globalized.
So that what you're talking about, I'm not endorsing that way of thinking, but that is kind of this mainstream way of thinking about this. So East and versus West are cultural terms and not geographic terms. So like South America would fall into the category of the East in this equation because it's these cultural definitions versus the global North and global South thing, which are economic. And folks, I mean, I also say this to point out that the use of the term third world is kind of no longer used in academia anymore. You don't really see it used. Instead, you see these sets of terms being used to differentiate between whether or not we're talking about like an economic disparity or a cultural difference, okay? I might also add as a small aside right here, and some of you might have seen this noted in your reading reflections or in your midterm when you get them back, but saying America, you want to say the United States as much as possible. If you say America and like in America, comma, something, 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 right? In academia, we always say the United States, and you should do that too, because America is kind of a set of continents, right? Referring to both North America and South America, and also including Central America, though not technically a distinct continent. So saying America instead of the United States is kind of like, you know, people in academia take issue with it. So it's something to work on in terms of language, right? Because the United States is the official country title and not America. Like for all government documents, legal purposes, anything like that, it's the United States. So try and use that in writing. Yeah.
So
Oh, sorry.
Developing nations, is that still used or?
Yeah, so that's still used a lot in kind of the economic world, in economics. So for people who do like, who focus on like global finance and stuff like that, that language is words like underdeveloped or developing. However, the word undeveloped is a term which is now no longer used in any field, pretty much. Yeah, unless it's like zoning and it's like this is an undeveloped parcel of land or something like that. Yeah.
I've seen people trying like define the East and West and cultural concept of like thinking of the West as countries that are like European culture dominated. So that's why people say, or like I suppose say like America, since they basically came from England.
Yeah.
So they're England's in Europe, so they classify America as Western, but then like South America isn't as influenced by European culture, so it's classified as East.
Yeah.
So
Well, and also it has to do too with kind of over time a taking of any countries that were under Spanish and Portuguese control and disassociating them with Western modernity, kind of. Yeah.
Do the cultures like East and West, do they correspond to like politics in terms of like the West is associated with capitalism and like the East communism, or is that like different lines, like different distinctions?
Yeah, that's like a very specific moment in time when those terms would have been understood that way. But no, for all intents and purposes, even in politics, you'll see kind of the global North and the global South used if they're talking more about economic issues. And then you'll see the East and the West talked about more when they're talking about a difference between styles of governance, putting like representative democracies kind of as like Western and other forms of governance as being like non-Western. But even that's changing, you know. These terms are terrible, right? In a globalized moment, these terms don't help us too much because there's so much overlap that these borders, that's kind of what this whole second half of the class is about, is that these borders no longer are really becoming as relevant or helping us think as much about how power works, okay? So, now, switching back to our main topic, so practices of globalization have obviously opened up new avenues for cultural exchange. And as we've already talked about extensively, culture really broadly, thinking of surface and deep culture all at once, becomes a means for representing your own identity, and thus becomes a means for communicating about identity broadly. So for Flaherty, one of our authors for this week, who wrote the article that we have on mixed martial arts, Flaherty argues that popular culture becomes a site where bottom-up notions of identity are met by top-down notions of identity. So, for example, the clash between how you feel, right, as an individual from the bottom up versus how the media tells you to feel from the top down, right? So when we're thinking of top down, we're thinking of these major institutions that send us messages about how to perform our various identities. And where we're thinking about bottom up, we're thinking about more of an individualist or perhaps more of a local approach to masculinity. So let's kind of pick this apart a tiny bit by talking about examples of how masculinity changes based off of place. So, do folks feel that most people in most cities in the United States do their masculinity the same way as people in other cities in the United States? No. But you knew to say that because this class is pretty consistent about how where you are and your location changes everything. But let's talk examples. So does anybody come from a life who grew up in a place that was very, very distinct from Tucson in terms of lifestyle, the land, stuff like that? So, Brenna, where'd you grow up?
Northern Virginia.
Okay, and what was different about where you grew up than here in Tucson?
Like culturally or like physically?
Culturally, physically, things that kind of might pertain to how people do masculinity or femininity differently where you grew up than here.
Well, it was a lot greener.
Okay,
A
well,
lot greener.
yeah, don't rub it in.
People generally were a lot meaner.
Mhm.
Like I worked customer service when I was there, and yikes, it was not fun. But cause I lived 30 minutes south of DC, so I got all the bureaucrats and everything, and they're all super full of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was.
Okay. So I could extrapolate a particular type of masculinity from what you're describing, but actually, one of the articles this week really talks about that sort of business masculinity, the sort of kind of businessy masculinity in particular. Yeah.
I'm from Colorado, right outside of Denver. So
Where are you from?
it's called Urbana.
Okay.
No one knows it, but
I have family in Greeley. That's why I asked. So yeah.
and so all the guys there are ripped because everyone does outside.
How do I get there?
sports. What?
No, I'm joking.
And everyone is just they are very masculine. They love to hike and they love to do all this outdoor stuff. They love to kayak and it's just really interesting. And a lot of people love to go to shooting ranges. It's just really I mean, there's other types of masculinity, obviously, but it's just really distinct because everyone has a beard and they wear flat and they're mountain men,
I'm the city interpretation of that, right?
Yeah, kind of. And then so I don't know, and Colorado is a really really fit state,
Mm-hmm.
so everyone is super muscular there. Everyone runs everywhere. It's crazy.
Okay. So now you're kind of getting towards something that I wanted us to be able to get towards, which is how masculinity really exists differently depending on whether or not you're in a really metropolitan context versus in a more rural context. So there are other folks who kind of come from more rural backgrounds. Were those all big city folks that were starting to raise their hands? So Christy, do you come from a more rural background?
Yeah, I was just gonna say in Texas, it was very different.
Okay.
It was jeans, t-shirt, or flannel,
Uh-huh.
cowboy hat.
Boots.
They were all boots. They were always doing something outdoorsy.
Uh-huh.
And then just the way they that macho
What kind of what's a masculine vehicle to own in Texas?
truck.
A
Everybody
truck?
had a truck. And
You
if
don't
didn't
even
have
need
a
to
truck-
work in construction. You can
and
work
if
at
you on the truck you had to.
Yeah.
Was it a Chevy? Was it a Ford?
Right.
Yeah,
And if you have a Toyota, you might as well just leave Texas,
basically.
right? Yeah.
And then I came here and
What kind of a car would the uber the most ideally masculine guy in Tucson drive?
I feel a lot
Tucson's a
of people-
tough place though, because it's this
I
weird
don't know. A lot of
mix.
people here I feel like I see like a lot of like Honda Civics.
Okay.
Like, Priuses even. But like I remember like walking like through downtown and like guys wearing like the big hats
Yeah.
and like tank tops with like really long shirts or like Sperry's and stuff like that. And that was just really different to see because like in Texas like that wouldn't be considered like masculine at all.
Yeah, and Sperry's are just miserable shoes to
Yeah.
wear. They get so dirty so quick. The resale value on them is terrible at Buffalo. So, okay, so other folks who come, anybody from a really more metropolitan area? Yeah, Elle?
So it's kind of a crazy experience, but I went to boarding school in Toronto, and so I went to an all-girls school, but then like our whole area, it was a bunch of single-sex schools. So like the boys' schools, a lot of them like we had a brother school called
Mhm.
Upper Canada College, and a lot of the guys there were really they cared way too much about like the designer labels that they were wearing and like how their hair looked and all this other crap. And I like.
I mean, you can never care too much about labels, but I'm kidding, of course.
Yeah, so stuff like that, like it was a bit different from other kids in Toronto, like that were going to like regular schools who were more like varied.
Yeah.
And so they were more kind of like uniform
Okay.
in everything that they did.
Okay. Any other folks who have kind of a story about a particular type of masculinity? Let's take one more. Yeah, Sam.
I'm from like Syracuse, Florida, but so it's really like we have like a lot of gang problems. So like guys that are all in gangs, their masculinity is like predominantly how they like live on the street.
Yeah.
School.
And I'm going to talk about that in particular a bit later today. And that kind of is this. We talk about this idea of the cool pose. This is talked a lot about in masculinity studies, about the various ways in which cultivating your masculinity requires you to like appear not just aesthetically, but in terms of your attitude in a certain way. You know what I mean? So like the cool pose is about just being like chill, relaxed, like you don't overreact to anything. You would never be like, oh my God, like you got a new haircut, that looks great. Like that, masculinity gone in the cool pose kind of like approach to things, right? So what we're getting then here, right, to take this all together, is that how you do your masculinity and the different types of masculinity that are valued vary depending on your locality, right? And they're also intersectional depending on your class, depending on your race, right? Even depending on your sexuality, perhaps. So I do that to illustrate this idea that oftentimes when people think about masculinity or think about gender, they think about it as kind of this individual thing and this local thing. But in the current moment, we need other ways of talking about it. Now, Connell, who has the article in our book for this week on masculinities and globalization, kind of provides at the beginning of that article a little history of masculinity studies, which dates back a few decades. And Connell argues that most of masculinity studies has focused on the individual, right? Like a study of a particular person's masculinity, a particular popular figure, or perhaps studies of very, very local things, right? So, for example, I always was fascinated by the ways in which the Seattle hipster movement kind of started this new sort of approach to masculinity, which really changed a lot of things in a lot of places, right? So, I grew up in the 90s. Hindsight being 2020, our fashion was not great, right? We went from the 80s, which were like amazing, and then the 90s, right, was just like baggy jeans and flannel shirts and like Converse. I mean, we weren't, it was what it was, right? So now I think, fashion is kind of, in this really, really cool moment again. But if you look at like the history of hipster fashion, which really challenges the sort of kind of like masculinity that was embodied in the 90s through things like the grunge movement and stuff, that really challenged these ideas about how men should dress, that really opened up the opportunity for men to wear tight, skinny jeans, effectively making it so I can no longer find jeans that fit at H&M or at Forever 21. Like everything is skinny jeans now. I don't know when that happened. But, the point is, right, that was very, very specific to Seattle. And a lot of people have talked about how Seattle was this kind of particular place in which something like that could emerge. And a lot of studies of masculinity focus on the local. However, gender and masculinity specifically in this day and age need to be contextualized within the current global moment. So although we can talk about how masculinity varies from place to place and how masculinity is intersectional, we can also at the same time talk about how particular masculinities are becoming globalized and becoming instantly recognizable around the world. And in particular, right, the articles that we look at for this week focus on specific types of masculinity. One of the articles focusing on mixed martial arts and how that relates to masculinity. And then the other one kind of surveying more broadly different types of masculinities that are becoming globalized, right? So, that is to say also not just framed within the current global moment, but also framed in a way which is aware of how cultural imperialism might facilitate the one-way exchange of one type of masculinity from the West to the non-West. So, globalization facilitated cultural exchange has allowed for the exchange of countless cultural products that pertain to or are used to express masculinity. So I've been talking kind of a bit generally about masculinity as this thing being exchanged, but we can look at a few specific examples. So for example, with fashion,
I think the world has become a really small place because it is. I mean, you can see everything about anyone. The internet has kind of really brought the whole world into everyone's living room. So I think it is. It's very universal. I think we passed the point of returning. So. No, I think it'll always be, accessible to everyone in regards to, this style. I think in a way, there'll always be, I think the memories of that true American style that, for me was that 50s and 60s on the sack suit from Brooks Brothers. I mean, that was a true American style. But in a way, there's a lot of people that have adopted that right now, and it's the same thing with designers here in America. The European influences. I think we've gone past the point of unless you really pull back and want to do it, I think the world has become very universal.
right? So he's a famous designer talking about how all of these sorts of local styles, right, that are here kind of implicitly coded as being non-Western styles, right, are disappearing in the face of this more universal growth of this kind of Euro-American clothing style. And if you think about this, right, so excuse my particular use of search terms here, but here's an example, right? So this happened last year. I was really fascinated by this, right? So here's a Daily Mail, which is a trash source for anything, by the way, right? But this article hopefully just reports facts, right? So who needs Brooklyn? Meet the dapper bearded, pocket square wearing, bike riding hipsters of Iraq, right? That line, that perfectly captures, right, what we're talking about. So, who needs Brooklyn, right? This article begins by establishing that this particular approach to masculinity, right, that embodies sorts of, calls back to kind of more rural masculinity through a desire to have a beard, right, in contrast with this desire to also have high fashion, right, something that is like this really interesting combination, where if you go back to the 90s, a beard was always associated with kind of being like just a grungy, disconnected kind of guy. It was unkempt, you didn't use products in it, stuff like that. Where now we're seeing a beard be this kind of symbol of masculinity that is amenable to high fashion, right? That isn't so different from it. So, if you look at these articles, right, this aesthetic of these gentlemen who started this club in Iraq, right? Hashtag life goals, right? Also, this guy is like the spitting image of my cousin Bilal, and Bilal has like a beard that, like, if he died, you'd want to cryogenically freeze his beard on its own. So, right? But this is so familiar to us, right? Like, this is so familiar. This could exist anywhere. I mean, ironically, this is more American than you would find most people in Tucson dressing like. I mean, yeah, the weather is hot, so we have this Tucson casual thing, right? But this is like entirely Western, entirely Euro-American, and entirely globalized now, right? And this article could be written about just almost any country in the world where we're seeing this kind of upsurge of this particular approach to masculinity and fashion all over the place, right? So we could also look at music, right?
Over the last few decades, hip-hop has had an impeccable influence on a global scale. Hip-hop writer Lonnie Nagi believes that hip-hop is not only influenced but receives contributions of artistic value from Japanese and Korean participants.
It's definitely diversifying, so automatically it's going to be people from wherever. They're going to wake up just like you. They're going to listen to the same thing like you, so you got to keep that in mind. But as far as the culture, I mean, it goes right along with the same thing. It's something that we all have a part in. We don't, it's kind of like we're almost afraid to look into other countries or whatever, but I kind of like different genres and seeking music in other places. A lot of people don't know that Japan is one of the biggest countries that's really into like reggae. They might be more into reggae than you. I mean, they're really on it, and a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people are not up on K-pop, Korean hip-hop, Korean pop music. It's big. You know, the concerts, I think, it's like twice a year or whatever, and it's like really major. And I think we need to pay attention to that because, you know, you never know. Just like with anything else, if you take it for granted and you really don't pay attention and have that responsibility, you know, somebody might take that.
All right. So here, I mean, we could, on a surface level, just read this as being kind of this exchange of hip-hop music, right? But really what we're seeing with this one small example is not only an exchange of hip-hop music, but also kind of a globalization of a particular sort of context-specific masculinity, right? A masculinity that endorses this idea of the cool pose, right? And if you look at any of these Korean and Japanese rappers that are being shown, right, and you look at this sort of
Bigger than you. I mean, they're really on it, and a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people are not up on K-pop, Korean hip-hop, Korean pop music. It's big. You know, the concert.
right. So this sort of style of dance, this use of hand movements, facial expressions is all used to sort of generate this idea of the cool pose, right? Which is particularly a byproduct, right, of a very context-specific Black American urban experience, right, in which young men, right, and this came into hip hop, right, because hip hop was largely an expression of urban life, right, living in different racially segregated cities in the United States. That in those cities, young Black men being raised by their parents were taught that in order to avoid, you know, danger, that in order to avoid getting beat up, that in order to avoid, you know, excessive harassment by the police, you had to learn to develop this sort of cool pose, right? This ability to just go out into the world, calm, cool, and collected, ready for anything, able to handle anything, but also remaining like chill and not overacting, right, so as to not arouse suspicion or excessive attention. And people have written extensively about the kind of culturally specific origins of this idea of the cool pose. And this is then being adopted all over the world in the same way. Here's another example through sports.
When you think of sports in India, you might think of cricket, or maybe field hockey, or even tennis. But one that doesn't spring to mind is American football.
I ain't never loved nobody ever gonna love me.
That's the kind of thinking the EFLI is out to change. The Elite Football League of India is actually 8 teams from India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka playing American-style football in their very first season. With names like the Delhi Defenders and the Mumbai Gladiators, organizers say they hope to become the most valuable sports franchise in the world. But some observers are skeptical that the sport will catch on.
Just from an Indian viewer's perspective, they have had absolutely no understanding and introduction to the sport of American football. So my gut feel would be that it is an uphill task to get American football, get any level of following over here in India.
So, how to sell a new sport? By warming up the crowd. And this is how it's being presented to the Indian public. Games are pre-recorded and then boiled down to a fast-paced hour-long highlights reel. With music and high production values aiming to catch a budding fan's eye. In fact, all of the games have already been played. They were filmed back-to-back in just a few short weeks at a near-empty stadium in Sri Lanka.
We got guys that were like all over the place. You know, we got a couple rugby guys, guys that play sports. We had like one guy in the sticks, 6'5", sitting at the hotel.
American coaches are building the teams, and the league has some star power behind it. Former NFL Hall of Famers Mike Ditka and Michael Irvin and other big names like actor Mark Wahlberg are financial backers. But it's tough to find players. Rugby is American football's closest cousin, and that is a big recruitment pool. For many players, the sport is as new to them as it is to the public.
American football's biggest challenge over here in India will be to tackle cynicism. It will be to get people to play to any level of professional competence.
Dodson rocks the ball, takes the plate.
A fan base is building, at least online. Spoiler alert, though, if you visit this fan site, it's already updated with the overall winner for this inaugural season. Ram Gopal, CNN, Atlanta.
All right, so here we see another example of how a particular Western cultural artifact or cultural practice that we might not think of as being all about masculinity on the surface, right, is being exported all over the world, becoming more and more popular all over the world, and with it, sending messages about how to do your masculinity, right? Because as we've already talked about, whether it be the article on Barbie dolls or the articles about athletes, most people try and mirror their own femininity or masculinity off of these cultural icons that have been sold to us as kind of this perfect, ideal sort of masculine figure. And what that means is for a lot of people who aren't professional athletes, who don't do sports for a living, heck, who might not even, play in the intramural leagues here at the university, right, that they try and model their bodies off of professional athletes whose full-time job it is to be athletes, right? And when you think about what that means then for the health of men, right, we can see the results of that really clearly. Excessive abuse of steroids, excessive abuse of gyms, doing bad styles of workouts, approaching workouts in a bad way, the use of things to be able to bulk up as much as possible, to be as big as possible, right? And all of these things oftentimes come with their own set of health effects, right? So, for example, I mean, there's nothing, I'm in no way have any judgment about using, various powdered supplements and stuff, as I'm someone who makes protein shakes at home pretty regularly. But I once fainted because of using too much creatine without drinking enough water, right? Does anybody use creatine, familiar with what it is, right? Creatine is used to help with muscle recovery and with mass retention and growth when you're working out. So a lot of people add it to protein shakes along with protein, right? And I ended up in the hospital because of fainting, because creatine ends up accumulating in your body if you don't have enough water on a regular basis, right? And I was trying to work out all the time. And wasn't drinking enough water, and then this happened, right? And that's a relatively small thing, but if you look at, the effects of mass steroid use, there was a guy in the bodybuilding world very recently, Rich Piana. Does anybody know who I'm talking about? Rich, yeah, James, do you know his name?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Rich Piana, right? And Rich Piana was like a YouTube bodybuilding guru, right? This is him that you might recognize from different videos, right? And he just died very recently at a very young age, right? And even though they haven't put out a final toxicology report, everybody, pretty much all the doctors have said that it's a result of ongoing problems that came from excessive steroid abuse, right? And in the case of Rich Piana, like, that's his source of income. He was a bodybuilder and a trainer and made videos and stuff like that. But there's so many men all over the country who are, really abusing these sorts of drugs. treating their bodies terribly to kind of achieve this sort of ideal masculinity, this ideal masculine body that we learned about from professional athletes who, literally spend 8 to 10 hours a day doing that sort of work. So that also means that because of the exportation of things like MMA and American football all over the world, we're also seeing changes all over the world in how men perform their masculinity vis-a-vis their bodies, okay? So we see this one-way exchange of information with very few men in the West modeling their masculinity off of non-Western cultures, but many men all over the world adopting Western approaches to masculinity. Now, Connell, in their article, traces the history of masculinity, or the history of the globalization of masculinity, to colonialism. So Connell argues that many colonial practices brought Western notions of gender, sex, sexuality, ethics, and other topics to bear on colonies, right? So if we go back historically, we see that all over Africa, the Middle East, Asia, all over the world, countries and different societies had systems where they had more than 2 genders, had systems where people were able to move between gender positions, had systems that were accepting of homosexuality in multiple forms, right? But during colonialism, colonial nations brought with them priests, brought with them a number of experts who taught, right, these colonies about how to properly do gender, how to properly do sexuality, instilled in those places all around the world 2 and only 2 gender systems, and also taught those places that homosexuality was a sin, right? So if you go back then to, let's say, for example, colonies in Africa, during the 1800s and 1900s, in order to be successful in one of those colonies, you had to mirror Western cultural norms. If you wanted to be a diplomat, if you wanted to go into politics, if you wanted to be successful in business, as an African living under British colonial rule, you had to dress like you were from England, you had to talk like you were from England, and you had to mirror Victorian Christian values like you were in England in order to receive the respect and recognition of the colonial government, right? So through those processes, Connell argues that Western gender hierarchies and norms, along with ideas pertaining to morality and sexuality, first appeared in the global South more than 100 years ago, right? So from then onwards, Connell describes how there is a world gender order to discuss how particular gender hierarchies become globalized. So while local approaches to gender still remain, right, and continue to bear weight on how people perform gender, over the course of the colonial and neo-colonial present, right, or the colonial past and the neo-colonial present, there is a particular gender order that has become globalized. And often this globalization isn't benign. Often it reflects processes of cultural imperialism. So going back to that metric, right, of power and agency and 2-way decolonial exchange, we could say that we see really a one-way movement of masculinity from the West to the global South, right? Can anybody here provide me with an example of ways in which men in the United States are adopting non-Western approaches to masculinity? Like, I certainly couldn't think of any, right? The next, we see an ideological privileging of Western masculinity as superior, and along with that, the denigration of non-Western masculinities as inferior. Now, perhaps the perfect capture of this in popular culture to me would be the image of Captain America, right? The image of Captain America is meant to be a stand-in, right? A literal personification of the nation of the United States, right? His history involving the Cold War, other major wars, fighting terrorism in the contemporary moment. All of these things really make it so that Captain America becomes a stand-in, right, as his name would indicate, for the West, for the United States, and in particular, a perfect embodiment of what masculinity in the United States looks like, right? And we could say that at any particular point in time. If you look at, for example, right? If you look, for example, at G.I. Joe, and you look at the evolution of G.I. Joe's body over time, what you see is that when you go back way in time, let me see, is this... if you go back way in time, right, you see this sort of evolution of G.I. Joe's body over time, from this being more of kind of the ideal masculine body to becoming increasingly more muscular, increasingly more defined over time, right? If you think about basketball, football, or any major American sport, like I'm a big basketball junkie, and if you look at basketball in the 70s or the 80s, the way the sport was played and the bodies of the men playing that sport were entirely different. They weren't as muscular, they weren't as big as they are now, and the way the sport has changed has become more aggressive, more about physical contact, right? And all of that has to do with this kind of changing preoccupation with what masculinity should look like here in the United States. Now, Connell then ends up from all of this describing hegemonic masculinity, which we can already know the definition of since we know what hegemonic refers to, right? And in this case, the increasingly promoted and desired form of masculinity that emerges within the West and is promoted globally. But the thing is, this isn't benign, right? Besides the fact that this is culturally imperialistic, it also carries with it really real material effects. In other words, these processes harm people. They harm men as men, and they harm women through their relationships with men as these approaches to masculinity change, right? So the promotion of masculinity, I got ahead of myself, sorry. So to provide more context, right, the promotion of Western masculinity is not just a matter of random chance. As with colonialism, neo-colonialism, right, these things, this promotion emerges specifically within capitalist relations. In other words, as we already learned from the film that we watched last Thursday, The Illusionists, right, there's a lot of money to be made off of making men feel like they're not manly enough and that they need to spend money to do things to become manly, right? So for example, in places across the global south where beards are becoming newly popular again, largely because of the growth of popularity of beards in the West, you're starting to see special surgeries and transplants for men who aren't able to grow a beard to be able to have follicles put into their face to be able to grow one so they can appear successful, right, and very, very masculine within their own sort of world, right? I personally think, I've always had a beard kind of for a long time. I haven't shaved my face in maybe a decade. And I've had so many countless weird, I always see things through this gender studies sort of lens, and I've had so many weird interactions with people in public where I'll be like maybe at a bar, and some guy will come up to me and he's just like yoked, just like huge, huge, huge dude, and he'll be like, whoa, nice beard, bro. Like, and in that moment, it's like this weird masculine thing taking place, because in a way, he kind of like validated my masculinity, like in a way that's like, I don't know how to say put me above him in terms of like this moment, you know what I mean? But I'm looking at him and being like you're telling me nice beard, like I know I can't say it, but like nice body, very masculine of you, by the way, right? So something as simple as facial hair, right, becomes a way of reclaiming, right, or trying to gain masculinity in the absence of maybe the super big muscular body, right? So there's a lot of companies that stand to make a lot of money from men not feeling like we're manly enough. So I might ask, who here who identifies as male spends money on something to help with their performance of their masculinity, perhaps in a way that gains you the sort of kind of recognition and feelings of goodness that you desire? Yeah? What? Cologne? How much do you spend on cologne?
Maybe like $50 a year.
It's not too bad, yeah.
Whoa, 'cause I have friends who drop like 150 every month.
Right.
Then again, they have gas.
And what's the logic? What's the logic for you of putting on cologne? Why do you do it?
I used to smell really bad all the time.
Just put yourself out there for us. Okay, yeah.
I don't smell bad all the time, at least no one tells me, so.
There you go, yeah. She's smiling. She's like, I don't know, I've had a different experience. But does a part of you hope that someone else will smell you and think to themselves, man, this guy, he's put together, he's got his life together, he's putting on cologne every morning, like, do you think that at all?
Not like exactly like that, but yeah, the general is.
Yeah, because I put on clothes all the time, and 100% of it is for other people, right? Like, I mean, I definitely do it hoping that somebody's going to be like, "Wow, Alex, you smell nice." Like, that must mean, like, you got your shit together. Really, though, right? Like, I mean, seriously, that's the thought that goes through my head. Yeah. So.
I also like razors.
Uh-huh.
I can't grow hair. I'm not looking to drop like $200 to get all the my face.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't know. I was raised in like a really professional household. Like I talked to my dad like business deals. So I'm not for real. Like I get made fun of.
Yeah.
Like all the time. But I stay like clean shaven 24/7.
Yeah.
I just think it looks more professional. It looks more clean cut. So
I see what you're saying.
I'm not saying you don't. You gotta get beard.
I teach in gender studies. We're not held to very high standards, you know, like.
Yeah.
I was wearing like a beer shirt that I intentionally changed it to teach today. Like I was wearing a beer shirt this morning, and it said like drink beer from here with the Arizona state around it. And I like had to intentionally change it to come and teach. But I knew that at the end of the day, if I didn't, like I probably wouldn't get any sort of flack from people. Yeah, what do you spend money on to perform your masculinity? That's no, you had a different thought. Okay, yes.
Like, well, I'm not like a cisgender female, but I used to have this boyfriend who would go and like he like grew like really patchy beards and he goes, I need a full beard, like I like have to have a full beard, and I just like didn't understand it. So like he would go online and like research. He would like take like 3 pills a night and it did nothing. Like he would be like, yeah, like I spent all this money online, and he would like get them shipped in from like some weird place, like some really sketchy website, and like he thought they worked, but they didn't. Like he just like really wanted a full beard. I never understood it.
And it's interesting because a lot of these products are promoted as though they're solving some sort of a medical, right, issue, when really they're about cultivating masculinity, right? So for example, like this idea of low T. Has anybody seen these commercials for like testosterone boosters and about low T, right? How do the men describe the effects of low T? Is my body is gaining fat and I have a lower sex drive, right? Reasonable concerns, of course, but like all about gender and all about sexuality, right? All about saying like there's this particular way that I've learned I need to perform my masculinity, and as I'm getting older, the natural drop of testosterone levels in my body isn't allowing me to do that, right? And then you see these commercials that are like, this guy walks out with like a 12-pack and he's like, wouldn't you know it, I'm 127 and I'm like a great-great-grandfather and you can look like this too at 127. And I'm just like, dang, grandpa, that's awesome. But like you're also like, wow, you would never see something like that long ago, right? And all of this is sort of changing, right? And it's because there's a lot of money to be made off of it, right? And I spend money on protein powders. I spend money on clothing. I think about, like, I carry a lot of fat in my chest area. It's hard for me to lose weight here. It's like the last place I lose weight. So I'm always thinking about how a shirt sits on me. And I'll pay for just extra money for a shirt that just sits on me in a way that makes it look as though this is 100% muscle and 0% fat, right? You know, and I will spend extra on that versus just putting on any t-shirt that simply fits over my torso and being happy with that, right? And all of that is about cultivating a particular sense of my own masculinity in relationship to other people, right? And I'm like happily in a relationship. I'm not even going out like trying to meet people. I'm still just like, it's for me, but it's all about how other people will interpolate me, how they'll read me and do things that kind of validate that the way in which they're seeing my masculinity is the same way that I see it, right? Yeah, Elle, and then I'm going to go on.
So, like, my brother was growing out his hair a few years ago, and we both have really curly hair, and so everyone would always comment on his hair whenever we go places, and they'd be like, wow, like, what do you do for it with your hair? And he'd be like, oh, I just wash it. But meanwhile, he uses all of my hair products, and my expensive hair products, and I'm like, you're such a liar. Like,
Yeah. Oh, that's so funny.
It just looks like that way.
Yeah, you know, we're planning out, like, in the new house. We have 1 bathroom right now, but in the new house, we're going to have 2. So this discussion has come up of, like, well, whose stuff goes in which bathroom, right? And I think I have, like, far fewer products and I'm less, like, messy. And, like, I have all these reasons that I'm like, I should get the bathroom that's off of our room. And the other bathroom, which is even bigger, you know, I was like, you have a ton of things. And Megan, she was like, she like opened the cabinet in our bathroom. The cabinet is like 2/3, like literally, like I probably have about 20 different beard and mustache products just like lined up in there. You know what I mean? Different smells, different things. You know, I even have a beard oil that smells like sugar cookies that I kind of bust out during the holidays, right? So, and she pointed it out, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. Actually, she's like, the other day, she's like, hey, did you notice like my makeup? And I'm like, what? And she's like, I started put like, I don't know what it was. She's like, I put on eyeliner, right? I mean, she's very like, bare bones with the makeup. And I'm like, I had no idea, you know what I mean? She's like, yeah, so she owns very few products, and I definitely own a heck of a lot more than her. Now, so talking about this global exchange of masculinity as this particularly culturally imperialist trend is important because it has effects on people, right? In particular, as men across the world are starting to mirror how they structure their bodies, how they perform their masculinity off of largely American, right, images of this sort of extremely strong, extremely toned man who embodies the cool pose, is able to be like, is able to switch from like a well-tailored suit during the day to wearing like, Levi's and work boots while he's building you like a tiny house to take to the forest in the afternoon in his free time, sort of a thing, right? This is becoming really, really available everywhere. But along with it comes a number of things. First off, along with it comes the idea that men, in order to be men, need to be more violent, right? And this is particularly problematic because it affects other men and it affects women who interact with and oftentimes become the target of this violence. And also it's problematic because as we continue to globalize an unrealistic expectation for what men are supposed to do and what they're entitled to if they do that correctly, then we're going to have increasingly higher numbers of men who are not able to attain that unrealistic standard and who, because of that, end up suffering from a number of problems. So this might be a bit before some folks' kind of like time, I don't know, but who here remembers the UC Santa Barbara shooting, right? At the UC Santa Barbara campus where a young shooter, a student there, same age as most of you, shot up, killed a number of people and drove around Santa Barbara shooting people on the streets around the university there. And if you've ever been to Santa Barbara, around the university, there's students everywhere. He wrote this manifesto, right, about how he was doing all the right things. He was, working on his clothing. He was working out. He was trying to get bigger. And all these women in college wouldn't sleep with him, right? And how he was so frustrated that these other guys who come from poorer families than him and who don't go to the gym are having sex all the time, and he's not, right? And he wrote this big manifesto before he went on this rampage in UC Santa Barbara. And increasingly, when men are told that they need to be violent in order to prove their masculinity, right? And at the same time are told, hey, do your masculinity in this impossibly unattainable way, then what we're going to see is an increased number of men who feel frustrated, who feel like their masculinity is being stolen from them, their power is being stolen from them, right? Their social prestige is being stolen from them, and they fall back into the one thing that they've been told to do, which is to be violent. So we're going to watch a short couple minutes from this clip, and this full documentary is available linked through our D2L page if anybody's interested in watching more. And this is the beginning of a documentary called Tough Guys 2. It's the second in a series by a man named Jackson Katz who studies violence in the United States, but also studies masculinity as well.
Joining us, two young men apparently dressed in long black trench coats opened fire at a high school just outside of Denver in Littleton, Colorado.
Please don't pack up yet.
Violence. It's almost like there are two Americas.
It's horrific. I can't even put it. You can't put it into words.
There's the America that recoils in horror whenever brutal mass shooting erupts onto our television screens, shocked by the level of destruction and suffering that just a few individuals are capable of visiting upon so many innocent people.
They say that the gunman opened fire in a theater during the showing of that latest Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises.
And then there's the America that can't seem to get enough of violence as a form of entertainment and ritual, a seemingly endless appetite for ever-intensifying spectacles of all-out brutality and carnage. The question is what sort of relationship, if any, these two Americas have to one another. And if we're serious about answering that question, we need to stop chasing symptoms and take a good look at a truth that's been hiding in plain sight all along. That when we talk about violence in America, whether it's real or imaginary, we're almost always talking about violent masculinity. I'm Jackson Katz, and for more than 25 years I've been studying the causes of violence. With especially greater rates of murder and gun violence we see in applying high-profile mass shootings we've seen over recent decades,
the far greater rates of murder and gun violence we see on a day-to-day basis that barely register in the national news, or the epidemic of sexual and domestic violence, the vast majority of this violence is committed by men, young men, and boys. The statistics tell the story. 86% of armed robberies are committed by men. 77% of aggravated assaults are committed by men. 87% of stalkers are men. 86% of domestic violence incidents resulting in physical injury are perpetrated by men. 99% of rapes are committed by men. Men commit approximately 90% of murder. And over the past 30 years, 61 of the last 62 mass shootings have been committed by men. But while these numbers are striking, they rarely if ever come into play in mainstream discussions about violence.
So, in this documentary, Katz takes a lot of time to talk about the ways in which, right, masculinity is becoming fast associated with violence, the ways in which violence is being celebrated in popular culture. But what Katz's point that Katz is trying to make in this documentary, which is particularly poignant given the current discussions that are taking place around gun violence, right, and the various, and the ways in which every single person has one explanation, at least, for why gun violence takes place, right? I don't know if folks saw how President Trump called a panel of, I'll put in parentheses, experts here, after the shooting at Parkland to talk about how this had to have been because of the increasing violence of video games, right? And the reality is, right, violent video games, which are played all over the world, oftentimes in places at much higher rates here, right? There's never been a single scientific study ever done that has ever shown that there's a link between watching violent video games and committing acts of violence, right? But as these statistics show, right, time after time after time after time after time, right, the majority of violent crimes are committed by men. And these statistics apply to other places in the world increasingly, right, as a particular approach to masculinity becomes globalized, right? And that's not to say that this is the only type of masculinity that's available in the West. In the West, there's diverse types of masculinities that people are able to engage in and perform, right, and through those performances gain recognition and social prestige. But the reality is, right, that it helps to be able to market one single type of masculinity to sell products, right? And oftentimes it's easiest to model that masculinity off of the people that are most available to us in pop culture, which oftentimes are athletes and actors, right, who typically are in fantastic shape. Now, we have two readings for this week. One from our book is called Masculinities and Globalization. The author begins by tracing a history of masculine studies, explaining the need to study globalized masculinities in addition to local ones. I tried to break out some of the page numbers a bit on this reading to help folks find where I'm talking about. They then begin a discussion of globalization and masculinity, which locates global masculinities in a colonial or imperial moment in history and extends them through modern-day capitalist relations. And Connell identifies a dynamic between these newly global forms of masculinity and local individual ones which push back against them. So these questions for Thursday, which I want folks to come really ready to talk about, is how did colonialism and imperialism structure gender and sexuality in colonies? What are some of the specific historical examples Connell provides? How does Western masculinity become globalized currently? Through what mechanisms, through what institutions, avenues? And what are some examples of global masculinities that Connell discusses? So on pages 46 to 49, Connell names a couple different types of masculinity, which they see as being kind of global in this moment. And then the second article, I will preface this by saying the article looks long when you first look at it, okay? Because it says that it's 64 pages. The last 24 pages of it are works cited and notes, which you don't need to read, right? The first 40 pages are double-spaced on regular paper, so it's a chapter from someone's master's thesis, so don't get intimidated, and it's actually very easy and interesting to read. So the article provides a cultural studies or textual analysis of mixed martial arts. In other words, Flaherty treats mixed martial arts as an artifact that can be read and analyzed to tell us stuff about the society from which that particular thing emerged, right? And they contend that MMA is a representation of U.S. empire and masculinity, that it reflects contemporary U.S. society's concerns, desires, and social preoccupations. In particular, Flaherty concludes that mixed martial arts and American empire both legitimize each other MMA represents U.S. cultural and gender-based superiority, but it is also legitimized by empire since it operates through structures of American empire. In other words, in order for MMA to become global, it requires certain, technological communication mediums owned by the West to be promoted in non-Western places around the world. And finally, MMA as a global expression of U.S. empire and masculinity is capitalist. And Flaherty says that really it involves the commodification of bodies for profit. So the questions folks want to come ready to answer is, how does Flaherty discuss the idea of a myth or mythology, drawing from Roland Barthes, an old linguist, very famous linguist. So Flaherty discusses MMA as kind of recreating this idea of mythology, of this gladiator coming into the ring and destroying their opponent, right? So Flaherty talks about that and why it's important. Why is it that MMA is like a mythology to Flaherty? What narratives about men and masculinity does MMA promote? In other words, if you were to be someone watching MMA, how would you likely end up wanting to do your masculinity? And finally, how is MMA being globalized in ways that contributes to the globalization of Western masculinity? All right, so come on Thursday ready to answer those questions.